his point is not, hey, buck up. It's like, I recognize that it's hard to be happy, but like, why? Everything's great. And in 200 years, life's going to be even better. They're going to have cured cancer and all that. And still, people are going to be like, oh, I'm not that happy.
Everyone, and welcome back to No Script, an unscripted conversation about theater's best scripts. I'm Jackson. I'm here with Jacob today, and boy, we are going back in time, not too far back in time, back sometime, to a hallmark of theater for sure, a return playwright to the podcast. Today, we are rounding out the set of well-known plays by Anton Chekhov. We're talking about Three Sisters today.
Yes, it is a milestone day for a number of reasons, many of which we'll get to as we go, but not the least of which is that today we are recording the 4th episode on Chekhov in the life of this podcast, which means we are rounding out the cycle of his 4, what we would call Chekhov's 4 major plays, his 4 masterpieces. Those, of course, being The Seagull, those being Uncle Vanya, being The Cherry Orchard, and today we come to Three Sisters, which is, I mean, you know, we just say, like, it's the least known of the 4, which is like, sort of like saying it's the least known color of Power Ranger or something. Like, everybody knows them, but, you know, if you're likely to have not read one of them or seen one of them, Three Sisters is probably the one you're least likely to have read or seen. It's... I mean, my experience with it is that it is kind of the least accessible. It's the most dense, I feel like. It's the least story-based, for darn sure. And so there are reasons why it's not as popular as the other 3. But again, that's just not saying much, because Chekhov is the second most produced playwright in the world behind Shakespeare. So, you know, it's like, well, do you really know the plot of Titus Andronicus really well? Is that the least known Shakespeare, or Two Gentlemen of Verona? It's still very well known. These are still classic, important scripts, and Three Sisters no exception to that. It is a masterpiece, as baffling and strange as it sometimes can be.
Yeah, you have to, you got to approach it with some of that same posture as you would approach a Shakespeare, of like knowing that this play was written in a very specific moment, in a very specific culture, with eternal themes. So there's this, like, there is oftentimes when you're coming to it for the first time, you're bouncing off of some stuff, you're bouncing off of like provincial army-based Russia, you're bouncing off of all of these names. There's like 3 names or 4 names for each character in the play, and they're used interchangeably. But like once you kind of weed through get through the weeds on some of those, you hit that gold underneath, that like, this is the reason why it's so produced.
And it is. I mean, this play has one of my favorite scenes in drama in it, which is, I mean, for those out there who don't know, it may be shocking. It is, you know, I keep a running note. Actually, it's now several notes in my notes app, because I've run out of characters in my notes app in each one, of just like cool quotes, just like as I'm reading. Sure. I do, you know, obviously I read a lot, and I see a lot of movies and all this. I engage with a lot of art, and as I do all this stuff that's so fulfilling, great in my life, I just keep like little quotes. Then I put them in scripts, or I use them, or whatever. They just inspire me, whatever. And like I pulled like 3 or 4 from the reading of this play. It's got that kind of sharp commentary and observation. Jackson and I, for this podcast, we read the Sarah Rule translation of the script. We'll talk a little bit about that in the context section. There's also another very well-known one right now that's kind of in the American lexicon. That's a translation by Tracy Letts. Very interesting, because Tracy Letts and Sarah Rule are, other than the fact that they're both incredibly notable American playwrights, about as different as I could imagine 2 playwrights being.
Sure.
And they have an American Theater magazine interviewed them, sort of. Really, they were interviewing each other about their individual writings of the translations rather of Three Sisters, about places where their process aligned, about places where their unique playwriting voice took kind of a different lens. But one of the things that they agreed on was that it's so hard to read or to do Chekhov in America because so much of the Chekhov we're getting is through the UK. Comes to us
Yeah.
because Chekhov got to the UK and then comes to America. We're just talking about like timelines, right? And so I can't remember which of them said this, but they were talking with a British playwright or adapter about Chekhov, and they said, to us, Chekhov is about the difference between being British and Russian. And either Tracy or Sarah, whichever of them said it, the point was sort of like, well, that has nothing to do with life in America. Just nothing to do with it. So the idea of not reading, I know this sounds like sort of a boring, annoying point, but the idea of not reading a translation by a British playwright, which is a lot of them are. A lot of the Chekhovs that you've probably read in high school or college or seen were probably done by a British playwright, because a lot of our Chekhov comes to us through Britain. And so it's like a Britain-sized Chekhov. And Tracy and Sarah offer these translations direct, not through British, not through the UK, but direct from the Russian to American English, to American culture. And so that was part of our decision to read Sarah Ruhl. Our podcast focused on contemporary American plays. Sarah Ruhl, contemporary American playwright. And this translation, not a UK translation, but an American translation of Three Sisters. It's not the definitive one. I actually, in places, I like the Tracy Letts one better, which is one I'm a little more familiar with before this podcast. But still, I thought, it to me was an easier read than other Chekhovs that I've read, just as a sort of basic premise.
Yeah, I think I agree. And certainly you get those, there's a couple moments, they're few and far between, but every once in a while there is something that's like, oh, that's sort of in my vernacular.
Yes.
And
Yes.
you hear the cadence of the American English and the American mindset as it approaches the Chekhov play, which is still like a very faithful translation of the Chekhov play. So it's cool to have that sort of like extra level of depth to the script as we engaged it this time around.
Yeah, and one other just difference in their approaches. Sarah Ruhl set out, she writes a really lovely, I guess I can't remember whether it's called a foreword or a preface or whatever. She writes a note at the beginning of the script, it's many pages long, about her process, but she specifies that her goal was to create as literal a translation as possible from an American playwriting perspective. Whereas Tracy Letts' translation goal, I think, was more about interpretation, trying to get Chekhov to an American ear without any obstruction. That's not quite how he says it, but that's pretty close. And Sarah Ruhl is more about trying to be faithful to what is exactly there in the Russian as close as possible. So different approaches, and those sort of yield different things, but that seemed like a positive, like check in the positive column for Sarah Ruhl's translation if you're trying to analyze Three Sisters, not necessarily just trying to create a new piece of art, but trying to look at Anton Chekhov's script as close as we can get. An American playwright trying to produce a very, very faithful translation seems like that for us as American dudes, that feels as close as we could touch, probably.
Yeah, I agree. That kind of like attempt to bring it into reality in this space. I agree. I think it was a great way to approach the script, especially with its historicity, which we'll get to when we get into the conversation a little bit more.
Absolutely. Before we get into it, we do want to ask everybody out there to consider heading on over to our Patreon page. Patreon is how we support the show. We have a lot of spectacular supporters on Patreon who make doing the show possible. We often say we love this show. It's a great part of our lives, but it's not possible for us to do in its current format or existence without the support of the people on Patreon. So if that's you, if you're already a supporter, huge thank you to you. You're making this show, this episode is possible by viewers like you. I think I've said that a couple of times, and I'm really hoping it's not PBS copyrighted. We'll find out if we get a cease and desist.
Might be public domain by
now. But thank you to those supporters. If that's not you yet, if you're not a supporter on Patreon, I just ask you to think about it. Check out the Patreon page. We've got a lot of positive reaction to a very sort of funny Patreon special clip that we posted at the end of last season. Check it out. The lowest tier is just $1 a month. I mean, it's $12 for the year. And at that amount, you're a huge help to us in making the show work. There's higher tiers, of course, for those that can afford it. But that $1 a month, super helpful. Again, thank you to those out there. If it's not you yet, please check us out. Patreon.com/NoScriptPodcast. All one word, no hyphens, no underscores. Patreon.com/NoScriptPodcast. And we will see you over there.
Yes, thank you all so much to those who have already made the decision to become patrons of the show. Y'all rocketh. We'll see you at patreon.com/NoScriptPodcast.
And one more announcement before we dive back into the world of the Three Sisters. Next week begins our themed month. That is 4 episodes, a group of a month, in release time, in this case, April 2025. But it's really like a little mini season. We do this every season where we spend 4 episodes in plays that have some sort of common interest, whether that's a playwright or a theme or a particular methodology or a time period or a whatever. We look at 4 plays and we have conversations across the plays, not just within every individual play. So cool thing that we're doing this year, or this season rather, really excited about it. Halloween in April. It's sort of like Christmas in July, but it's Halloween in April. We're talking about 4 plays that have something spooky going on. Some kind of supernatural element that's not just supernatural for the sake of something else, but for the sake, for the tone, for the feel of spookiness. That is our endeavor. We'll start next week with a play I just love, and a play whose playwright I got to talk to about the play. That's a little teaser for you for next time. Halloween in April starts next week. Hope you are back with us. Until then, we're back to the script.
Here we go.
So, Three Sisters by Anton Chekhov. As you know, if you're a regular listener, when we do these classic episodes, or sort of what we call them, we focus more on contemporary stuff. Occasionally we do a classic, quote unquote. When we do these classic episodes, it's just not super feasible to cover the context of the play in the same way as a play that came out in like 2015. So it's a much more surface level context than you'll often get when you come to this podcast. And I'm also going to cover both Three Sisters more generally and the specific Sarah Rule translation that we read. So this play is the third of Chekhov's major plays. The first was The Seagull, which is, of course, famously why the Moscow Art Theater's like emblem or logo is a seagull, because of the close ties between Chekhov and Stanislavski in the beginning of that company. This play's the third. The next one was Uncle Vanya, and then The Three Sisters, and then The Cherry Orchard is the fourth in terms of chronological order of the 4 major plays. It's also, by design, the most serious, the most dramatic. I think it's, at this point, kind of, if you're a theater person or in theater circles, kind of a semi-well-known fact that Chekhov's plays, while they're sort of seen maybe as these kind of serious works of tragic literature, and they have the Russian sensibility of being so dark and right? But that actually Chekhov intended them to be comedies. And in fact, The Cherry Orchard is intended to be like a farce. I mean, the Cherry Orchard has like pratfalls in it and like intentionally big jokes. And The Seagull is a comedy, definitely. Uncle Vanya, a little less so. It's more like, it's called Scenes from Provincial Life, or farming, rural community life. This play, apparently, as so it goes, is described by Chekhov in a letter as being gloomy. I mean, listen, I've written some serious plays as a playwright. I don't know that I would call any of them gloomy. That seems like of course, when we're talking about a translation of a letter that he wrote in Russian, but apparently this play, sort of by design, is much more serious. The tone, the tenor. There are not, I would say, jokes in this play in the same way as there are in the other of the Chekhov plays. The characters are more seriously minded, and yet it does have Chekhov's kind of characteristic lightheartedness at times too. It's a sort of a strange thing in that way. Chekhov wrote it in 1900, first performed in 1901 at the Moscow Art Theater, of course, directed by Stanislavski. It's one of the part of the sort of famous conflicts between Stanislavski and Chekhov about the interpretations of his work. Stanislavski was also in the play, as was a woman that Chekhov would actually go on to marry, who he wrote the role of Masha in this play for. Now jumping far, far, far ahead in time, as its popularity and preeminence in Russian theater circles is not anything that I know much about. 1942, The Three Sisters plays on Broadway. And then jumping ahead again, in 63, really cool feature, it's part of the inaugural season of the Guthrie Theater in Minneapolis, is Three Sisters. So part of the real history and legacy of the Guthrie Theater, obviously a major theater. 64, it's at the Actors Studio under the direction of the famous Lee Strasberg. Lee Strasberg, of course, is a Stanislavski disciple and brought a particular interpretation of Stanislavski's psychological realism called the method to America. And so you could see kind of the lineage direct from Stanislavski directing this play in 1901 to Lee Strasberg directing this play in 1964. 65, there's a radio version produced for the BBC Home Service. Ian McKellen was in that particular radio version. 67, it's at the National Theater. This is a pretty notable, famous production. It's directed by Laurence Olivier, who also acts. And that, not like the stage production, but the interpretation, the acting, it's turned into a film, essentially, in 1970, which is available for you to check out. 1982, at the Manhattan Theater Club, starring, listen to this cast: Diane West, Lisa Baines, Sam Waterson, and Jeff Daniels. That's four incredible actors who I would pay a lot of money to see do the the Three Sisters now. 1984-85 season, it's at Steppenwolf. Steppenwolf will come up here again in a moment. 1991, the Gates Theatre in Ireland at the Royal Shakespeare Company, a dual production. Famously, this production cast three actual sisters, the Cusack sisters, in the show as the Three Sisters. And the claim, at least, is that that's the only production ever to do that. I'm a little skeptical of that, but then you sort of think, like, how many families actually have three sisters who are all strong enough actors to do the show? So maybe that's true. Their father also weirdly was in the production. 97, at the Roundabout Theater, Paul Giamatti as the brother Andre. 2009, Artist Rep in Portland. That is where the adaptation by Tracy Letts gets its world premiere. 2011, Classic Stage Company in New York City, Maggie Gyllenhaal, Peter Sarsgaard, and Jessica Hecht. Wow. 2012, Steppenwolf again. This is the Tracy Letts adaptation. It's directed by Anna DiShapiro. A lot of great material out there surrounding that production, as Steppenwolf is just really, really good at creating production material that then can exist in legacy after the show. 2012, Young Vic. 2017, Studio Theater. That is an Aaron Posner project. So what the Studio Theater did is that they did these two plays. I've only been able to do a little bit of looking into this, but essentially it was the Three Sisters and then a play called No Sisters, which is by Aaron Posner, who wrote Stupid Effing Bird. So he writes these, they're not spin-offs, but these plays based off Chekhov plays. And my understanding of the theater event at the Studio Theater is that these two plays would run simultaneously, because No Sisters was about every everybody else in the play besides the three sisters. And so they somehow orchestrated this two play at the same time experience where one audience would see the three sisters and another audience would see no sisters, which was about the rest of the group, not the three sisters. Cool idea. I don't know, I have any idea really how it turned out, but hey, cool idea. I like that. Sarah Ruhl's version is based on a literal translation and then she worked with Elise Theron, Natasha Paramanova, which I think that's her sister-in-law, as I understand, and Kristen Johnson Neshati. It was commissioned by the Cincinnati Playhouse in the Park, received its world premiere in 2009. Then in 2011, there was a co-production between Berkeley Rep and Yale Rep. That production directed by the great Les Waters. Since then, it's been at the Piven Theater Workshop in Chicago, 2015 at the Epic Theater in Rhode Island, 2018 at the Undermain Theater in Dallas, 19 Ashland University Theater, 22 Anateus Theater Company in Glensdale, California, 23 at Baylor, 24 at the University of Buffalo, and April 2025. That's right. Next month, as of the recording of this episode, you have the chance to see Sarah Ruhl's translation of The Three Sisters at Baldwin Wallace University in Ohio. If you are in the Ohio area, I encourage you to check it out. I think that's a fair amount of productions for this play. I mean, since 2009, 16 years or so, and it's gotten looked like a pretty robust little production history there. My sense is that some of that has to do with Sarah Ruhl's name power. Like a lot of those productions you saw came in like 2015 to 25 decade, and that's really like, I would call that the decade of Sarah Ruhl in the American theater. Yeah. And so, a translation by Sarah Ruhl or by Tracy Letts brings in the name power of that translator as a playwright alongside the international fame of the title and playwright Three Sisters by Chekhov. So I think people like to do those, not just a translation by anybody, but a translation by Sarah Ruhl or Tracy Letts because of that additional layer of intrigue and, frankly, marketing, but also just like artistic energy that you can sort of bring is at least that's my sense of it, at least coming from a university program where we've discussed translations, adaptions by contemporary working playwrights.
Yeah, excited for the conversation around it today. As we've already kind of mentioned in the portion, it's cool to engage this particular translation of this play. So excited to have our conversation today. I'm going to try to summarize this for us real quick. It's worth saying that especially with these historical scripts, there's plenty of great summaries out there. Check them out. I'm going to briefly summarize just kind of the big through plot of this one, because otherwise this intricate of a script, we'd be in the summary for forever. So we're going to kind of kick us off here and learn a little bit about this family. This play takes place in kind of early 1900s Russia. Provincial Russia, and it follows this family, the Prozorova family. Additionally, I'm going to do my best with these names. I apologize in advance. So here we go. They've moved there in times gone by from Moscow into this kind of outer province in Russia. They moved there with their father, and the father has since died, leaving behind him three sisters, Olga, Maria, and Irina, and their brother Andrei. Now, they have kind of all gathered together on this particular day, this first act day, because it's Irina's birthday, and she's celebrating her birthday. And we meet a number of characters in this scene. We obviously meet Olga, who's the older sister. We meet Maria, who is, I'll give you a little bit more on Olga. Olga is kind of a school teacher, trying not to become a headmistress of the school that she is working at in the area. Maria is the middle sister. She is married to a character that I'll get to in a minute we'll call Kuligin, and somewhat discontent in that marriage. And then we have Irina, who is the youngest sister. They're all in their 20s. They're all very young. And the brother Andrei is even younger still, and yet he is sort of the heir of his father in the house in some ways. So they're all kind of gathered together and somewhat morosely celebrating this day because it's also either the day or very close to the day that their father passed away as well. So there is this kind of like, let's celebrate Irina's birthday, but also mourning the passing of their father from just a year ago. So into this scene comes a number of characters, and I'll just kind of give you a short introduction to them. We got Cooligan, who comes in, who's Maria's husband. There's a bunch of soldiers, the soldiers who are garrisoned in the town, all kind of regularly come in. There's Tutzenbach and Solioni, who are both sort of suitors of Irina. We have Chabotikin, who's a doctor, and then there's Fedotik, who's kind of a sub-lieutenant, and Rode, who are also a sub-lieutenant. They kind of fill the role of the passing soldiers through the room. Many of them are sort of courting Irina in some way, as she is sort of like the eligible one to be courted, but the two that are most notably courting her are Tutzenbach and Soliani. Then, of course, there is one other kind of captain of the soldiers who is Vershinin, and he shows up, and he and Maria hit it off. He says that
Masha.
he knew her.
He and Masha do. And and he's new to the town, and that's the big, like, if you're this is not a plot-centered thing at all. It's part of what makes Jackson's job here so difficult. But it's if you're looking for an inciting incident to the story, such as it is, it would be Vershinin's arrival at the town with his family. And he is coming from Moscow, which is where the three sisters used to live.
Yes, and that's a pretty like core longing of this first part of the play and really carries through for the whole play, is the sisters are lamenting that they've sort of been stuck out here in the provinces. Like they moved here in hope with their father for this sort of like sort of a rural simplicity myth, but their father moved them out here to become sort of important in this region, but they long for Moscow. They have this sort of like longing to go back to Moscow. That line is often repeated. And so when Vershinin shows up and he has that sort of like from Moscow air to him, he kind of adds that into the room, and Masha is drawn to that, and they kind of have a bit of a spark of conversation as a result of that. A big celebration sort of happens. Lots of tears are shed as they kind of hold the juxtaposition of this day, both the happiness for Irina, but also the memory of their father. The other kind of core piece from this first act, though, is we're introduced to Natasha. And Natasha is Andrei's loved one. She and Andrei are kind of courting, maybe even affianced. And she shows up, and she is much more provincial than these aristocratic and soldierly people are. And the sisters kind of give her a bit of shade for that. They speak down to her a little bit, are embarrassed by her clothing and etc., and basically tell Andrei, you shouldn't be like, there's plenty of other options. Why are you dating her? Nevertheless, Andrei continues to date her and kind of chooses her by the end of the scene, and we get the sense that they are going to be moving forward together. I'm going to move to the next scene. There's a lot going on in that scene. I'm going to move to the next one. We jump forward a year, and the child,
or some amount of time.
Some amount of time has passed.
This play's going to have 4 acts that Jackson's going to try to navigate through here. They all jump ahead in time, an indeterminate amount of time.
Right.
We know that it's at least long enough that Natasha's gotten pregnant and had a baby. That's really, and it's winter. But those are really the only, like, this script does not contain Chekhov's notes about, like, what year this is happening in, how many years later. Mm-hmm. It's just like the next act starts and it's the future.
Right. We get a blessing at the very end of the play that one of the suitors of Irina says, "For 5 years I've loved you," and you're like, okay, so somehow this fits in 5 years. But that's about the most concrete thing that we get. So Act 2 comes along. There's a child now. Andrei and Natasha have their baby named Bobek, and Natasha is starting to take over the house a little bit more. We start to see her using her influence a little bit more. She's much more. She like asks some of the sisters to move in together so that the baby has a better room that's less cold. And there's kind of more of this grinding of the gears happening between Natasha and the sisters. Additionally, Masha is kind of continuing to grow closer and closer to the Lieutenant Vershinin, and they seem to have progressed in their relationship to some degree, and they are kind of a little bit more out in the open about it. Additionally, Irina is continuing to be courted by Tutsenbach and Soliani, and there's a little bit more of foreshadowing beginning to emerge in here. Of Soliani eventually says, "I love you so much, I'd kill anyone else that would ever succeed in wooing your hand."
Bum bum bum.
Keep an eye out for that. I'm gonna move forward. There's so much stuff in that scene. Act 3, though, hits, and we're another indeterminate amount of time forward, probably a year adjacent. There's another child at this point. There's Sophia in the world, also Natasha and Andrei's child. And what's become clear is that Andrei has been gambling. He's not happy with his life. He thought he was going to be a philosopher, and instead he's sort of like this city councilman, essentially, a pretty high up city councilman. But in addition to his disillusionment with that sort of a world, Natasha has been cheating on him with the main city councilman of the town.
And it's just like everybody knows. Too.
Yeah, everyone is very aware
it's
of
this.
It's
not even kind of a secret. And one of those kids is probably the other dudes.
Uh-huh. Yep. Additionally, Kuligin has figured out that Vershinin and Masha have a relationship, and there's some melancholy there. The doctor also has a lot of melancholy, and he's kind of slipped back into drink in amidst all of his philosophizing about the state of the world. A big fire has happened in town in Act 3, and so the big moment of Act 3 is everyone's trying to deal with this fire, and it's pressuring everyone to kind of think about their life and what's going on out here in the provinces.
This is like the most active of the acts because of the fire. There's like a fire actively being put out in the village, and so the reason everybody's at the house in this scene, and all these scenes are at the house, but in this particular one, it's because the village, like the people who lost their homes, need a place to come and stay, and these three sisters, because of their father's post and their kind of independent wealth, have this large house that they've been living in. And so people are coming and going and buzzing all through this one as the fire is being combated and put out, and people need blankets and clothes and things like that.
They have access to the river where the water is, and so there's all this sort of hustle and bustle. In the midst of it, though, there's this really lovely kind of beating heart scene between the three sisters, because they've all been sort of like pushed into the same room because of Natasha's running of the house. Natasha also attacks one of the servants who's been really important to Olga. Olga tries to protect her as best she can, but Natasha is trying to fire her essentially because she's too old to work. And so you have all three of the sisters kind of reflecting on how this is not the way we thought it was gonna go. Olga is kind of being drawn further and further, or closer and closer to being the head mistress of this school, which wasn't really the direction she was hoping she was going to go. Also, her home has been mortgaged out from under her to pay for Andrei's gambling debts, and Natasha's running the house in a way that she doesn't appreciate. Masha continues to have this sort of dissonance with Kuligin, her husband, and this love for the lieutenant colonel, and she's trying to kind of hold the reality of those, and finally confesses it to her sisters in this scene. Irina is looking at the world around her. She's working in a telegraph job, like a municipal worker's job. And as she's holding the tension of, this is not what I was thinking it was going to be. I was holding out to get back to Moscow. When are we going to get back to Moscow so that I can maybe meet the love of my life, etc. and get life started again after this chapter here. And that's not materializing for her either. To the point that she eventually gets the advice from her sisters that you really maybe just need to pick one of these guys who are courting you so that you can have a life. And you maybe waiting for Moscow might not be your best course of action. And so she eventually...
And really just Tutsenbach. What's interesting about the courting is that nobody likes the other dude.
Yeah, no.
He's he's rough, man.
He's pretty bad.
He makes some really, really poorly colored jokes.
Yep.
He's constantly saying really crude, kind of rude things. Not a likable guy. And so the play, I don't think, really ever puts into the air that Irina might be with him.
Yeah.
It's just that he desires that, and that desire is going to prompt what ends up happening.
Yep. And Tutsenbach, she says, I don't love him. And her sisters are like, yeah, he's not that attractive or anything, but he's kind and he's a baron, so that's cool. And so she says eventually, okay, I think you're right. I'm going to choose that, and we'll find a way forward with that. Another amount of time passes, and we arrive in Act 4. Act 4, the big event that's happening, the two big events that I'll talk about at least, are the soldiers are leaving town. The station of the posting of all the soldiers has changed. They're being moved, a lot of them, to like a variety of places, and kind of being spread out all over the place. So all of these relationships that they've developed over, let's say, 5 years, because I think a line does lead to that, are slowly like getting pulled away from them. So in addition to their father being gone and the situation not being what they wanted, all of these relationships that they've developed with the soldiers who have been posted there are leaving. We do find out that Irina and Tutsenbach have been engaged, and that Tutsenbach has stepped away from the army in order to stay there as a part of their engagement. However, the other big event is Solinoi has decided to make good on his threat. He has challenged Tutsenbach to a duel as a result of some teasing that happened, and a duel is happening today, which is something that Irina is not told. Tutsenbach kind of like notes that he has to go out this morning. It's quiet uptown sort of moment. And he's going to be heading out to this duel. But in amidst of all of that, each of the sisters are kind of having their own, again, each of those three griefs. Olga has decided to take the headmistress job and lean into it. She's taking that older servant with her and kind of freeing her up from the oppression of Natasha. Andre is notably just like bemoaning his existence at this stage and what he thought life was going to be. Masha is saying goodbye to the lieutenant colonel for the last time he's leaving as a result of the army moving out of town. And Irina is thrown into this moment where she doesn't necessarily know that Tutsenbach is going to this duel, but knows that something's wrong. And so they're all kind of grieving this loss, grieving the loss of this dream that they had, grieving the loss of the home that they had, and noting that they're all leaving, but not for Moscow, that Moscow was a dream that would never really come about. And as if that wasn't sad enough, in the last couple of seconds of the play, the doctor like comes back on stage from the duel and lets them know that Tutsenbach has died. And there's just this like heartbreaking last scene of these three sisters, all of them needing to leave in some way, all of them having some direction in which to go, but none of them are the directions that they would have chosen certainly years ago or even at the start of the play. So you have this sort of like heartbreaking moment at the end of the play where Olga's kind of wondering if only we knew, and could have chosen better, which echoes what many of other characters have reiterated throughout the play as they've been philosophizing.
Yeah, I mean, so at the center of this play, right, is this family, these three sisters and their brother, and they desire at the very beginning of the play to return home. Moscow at the time, although we think of Moscow as the sort of metropolitan capital of Russia, at the time is just like another city. Petersburg is the capital. And so they're not really trying to return to like the place. They're just trying to return to their place. This is the place that they were raised, where they were children, right? You think about nostalgia. You think about this longing to go home. And yet they never do. In fact, they never take any concrete steps at all to be able to get back to Moscow. And so one of the comparisons that's made about this play, because I think when you try to apply to Three Sisters, what I think we think that we should be applying to Chekhov, which is this kind of realism, linear, action causes action, plotted devices with really great confrontations between characters who've got machinations working all through. Uncle Vanya has some of the great build-up to conflict that you can possibly imagine. But that is not what Three Sisters does. Three Sisters, to be really honest with you, kind of lacks a plot. I mean, there's a story, but there's really no plot. The stuff that happens all happens off stage and in the years between the scenes. Mm-hmm. What you get are these like little 30 minutes, an hour at a time, every couple of years, 4 times. These little glimpses of where this family is at every couple of years. And when you apply that to this standard of this like dream, right? I'm going to get to Moscow. And I'm not the first person to make this comparison. It's been made by many, many people much smarter than me, but I like it so much that I want to bring it up. This play starts to look an awful lot like an early precursor to something like Beckett, to something like Waiting for Godot. Endlessly waiting for what is never going to be.
Yeah. Yeah, that longing for home, and like the slow I think one thing that like connects to that. So yeah, that longing for something to happen, it's never happening. There's like a continuation of that longing over and over. You dream if only it would happen. This, I think that's one of the heartbreaking things about this play, is eventually the dream is lost. We end the play with some pretty definitive lines about like, guess it is really never going to happen. And I think that like feeds so much into that longing, makes the longing even the more painful because of the reality that they accept, which is that longing cannot come about.
Yeah, and inside of that longing, like stuff does happen in this
Sure.
play. The accusations of Chekhov that nothing ever happens are just untrue. But what Chekhov does so masterfully in all of his plays, and this play I think is like the pinnacle example of this, is it's not that he hides the things that happen, but it's the things that happen seem insignificant. Or their significance is not immediately known in the way that we expect it to be known in drama, right? Or in storytelling. Like when we're hearing a story, when we're watching a play, a movie, a book, when something important happens, the idea is sort of like, this important thing has happened.
Right.
And Chekhov is like the master at like questioning that. So here's the example, right? At the end of Act 1, Andre proposes to Natasha. Now, earlier in the scene, this is my own sort of reading of it, somebody says, like, Natasha already has a fiance. And you sort of wonder, like, oh, does he mean Andre? But then you sort of get the sense that everybody knows that she's also been seeing the head of the city council. So I actually wonder whether she was publicly engaged to him earlier. There's a stage direction at the end of Act 1 when Andre proposes and they kiss, that some soldiers walk in and they're surprised to see them kissing. And so maybe that just has to do with like cultural norms around kissing at a particular time and place. But I also wonder if it's because the soldiers are like, isn't she engaged to this other guy? But you don't know.
Councilman?
All that's fairly subtle. But what's not subtle is this: an engagement. Oh my gosh, how exciting! Young love. That's amazing, right? Except that engagement means the sisters are not going to Moscow.
Yeah.
Because from the very beginning of the play, we're still in Act 1, so we're still near the beginning, they've been saying the reason they're going to go to Moscow is because their brother is like a genius young scholar, and he's going to go take a position in Moscow at a university there. And when he proposes to a local woman, the implication of that is that he's not leaving. That they're going to stay, and he's going to stay as this kind of middle manager of the town. And so that is the kind of thing that Chekhov is so excellent at. That's really hard to get when you read it, and really, really hard to get when it's badly acted. But when you get to really great productions, you see that, oh, this proposal is actually a tragedy.
Yeah,
it's actually the end of hope.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I love that. I love, or a line that's sticking out to me in that, or an idea that's sticking out to me in that, is like the importance or the weightiness of ordinary things or otherwise missable things. And those like little moments that have such big impacts that could be missed.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. Although this play, of all the plays, I think also asks the question, like, how important is any of this anyway? I mean, this play, like, as soon as you start thinking about it as a precursor to Beckett, and then you're reading on a little bit to the play, I understand. But I do think all this is there. Then you start to see these questions of existentialism.
Yeah.
Like, what is our significance anyway? I mean, characters in Chekhov plays are well known for sitting around and philosophizing, and they do a lot of that in this play. But one of the central things that they're philosophizing is this question of, what do our lives mean? Are our lives for us now? Are they for some descendants possibly in the future? Do they mean anything at all? I mean, one of the great quotes of this play that sounds like something straight out of the mid 20th century existentialist plays. They're talking about the meaning of life, right? And Masha says, but there must be some meaning. She's the poetic, the romantic who's kind of trapped in this provincial life, right? She says, but there must be some meaning. Tuzenbach says, meaning. Look, it's snowing. What is the meaning of snow? Oh, I mean, like, you're telling me Beckett didn't write that?
Yep. Yeah, a lot of the Doctor's lines have that same sort of energy of like, it's
the
all the
Doctor,
same.
Absolutely, yeah. And the Doctor has this unique feature in the play that, again, I don't think it's really comes through very well in the reading, but he's reading a newspaper the whole play. And the stuff that he's reading out of the newspaper is just getting progressively worse.
It's worse and worse. Smallpox is breaking out.
Smallpox, war. And as that happens, he's consistently getting more and more, like, literally existential. Like, none of this matters. There is nothing we can do. Every decision we make is the same. And if, living into the realism of that psychology, like if he's an army doctor stationed in this town that's hundreds and hundreds of miles from anything, there's not even a railroad station, and all he can do is read in the paper about these disasters that are happening all over the world. And this question of like, well, what does any of this mean?
Yeah. Yeah, and especially like a lot of the soldiers have that. Certainly the Lieutenant Colonel Vershinin has a similar monologue set of like, what's the point of all this? Well, the point of it is like, our suffering brings about joy to the next generation, and that eventually we're going to meet a very utopian sort of model of like, eventually we're going to reach the point where like none of this matters anymore, because we'll have grown as a society beyond that point. And that so you have that like one view, right, that like none of this matters because of the future, because of what we're building to. We are only the sacrifices in the moment for the joy of the future of humanity.
Although I quibble with you a little bit. I don't think his perspective is that none of this matters. It's that it doesn't matter if we're happy or not. The significance of our lives is in building happiness for other people. I don't think he has the perspective that none of this matters. Their lives, I think, to him, really do matter, but only in like what they're creating for the future.
Yes, sort of like the Stoic model of like let's suffer in the moment for the benefit of humanity. Juxtaposed with what we've already been talking about, with the sort of like, gosh, what does matter? Sort of noting that a lot of what the Doctor talks about is, and a lot of what I feel like a lot of what the sisters end up repeating is the sort of battlefield for those ideas, because each of them repeats some fragments of that philosophizing as it pertains to their particular situation, to the point that like at the end Olga is saying something similar to the suffering for the sake of joy of the future that the Colonel was talking about, to try to make some sense of this, but like leaning into that there will be happiness sometime, but perhaps even yet now, even though it will be different. She hears the music of the soldiers walking away and is like, that music is so happy. What if there's a way for us to hold on to that happy in the moment, even as we suffer for the sake of the future?
Yeah, and then, I mean, Tuzenbach and Vershinin are the ones who kind of do the most kind of back and forth philosophizing. They have a great exchange, I think it's in Act 2, where they go back and forth about how life in the future is going to be, Tuzenbach's point is it's going to be essentially the exact same as it is now. We're going to, like, right now, Tuzenbach's point is like, right now, life is pretty freaking great.
Right.
Like what are we so upset about? Wow. I mean, his point is not, hey, buck up. It's like, I recognize that it's hard to be happy, but like, why? Everything's great. And in 200 years, life's going to be even better. They're going to have cured cancer and all that. And still people are going to be like, oh, I'm not that happy. And Vershinin's point is like, no, it doesn't matter if we're happy now. It matters whether we can create happiness in the future. So there are these like counter perspectives like on the future. And then there's this, like, the sisters hold this longing perspective on the past, this desire to return to Moscow. And this play ends up being this kind of strange little clips, right? Little hour scenes every couple of years that tell us really about the present. Like, what's going on now as the characters look backwards, look forwards, try to hold a backwards and forwards look, and the stuff that's happening now is the stuff of their life. And so this play, I think part of its tragedy comes in, like, the characters, not the center characters, not like having a real relationship with their present.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, trying always something sort of off stage, calling people off stage, sort of plays into some of that. Marriage comes under the microscope frequently in this play, as we've sort of maybe already alluded to in just the triangles that are going on. But like this, like pulling away off stage to where the significant others are, to where your other requirements are, prevents this sort of like long-lasting presence to what's going on, to the point that like there's so many tears in this play, and sort of like spontaneous tears. Sometimes they're like a result of a dam being burst, but like the first scene, there's multiple times where just one of the sisters will be like, I say something, I break out in tears. And a lot of that is that sort of like missed connectionsness of like, how do we stay present to each other as we're all searching so hard for what on earth could make us happy, even though we're in the midst of this sort of sadness.
Yeah, you're right. There's this like whirlwind of stuff that happens around this group. I mean, this is of all the four major Chekhov plays, to me at least, you probably could argue this, but I think it's pretty clearly the most ensemble of the plays. Like who could you even make an argument is the protagonist? I mean, who would you even start, right?
Right.
And it's not just a small ensemble either. There's a large cast of characters that come in and out and have little exchanges, and there's this swirl of society, right? Artistic director of Steppenwolf at the time, Martha Levy, during the Tracy Letts production, says, outside of their home, the sisters' home, there's a military encampment, a carnival whose performers are invited into their home but never arrive, a fire in the town, Natasha's lover in his carriage, a duel. All the movement, the excitement, the drama of the world is outside of them and is reported back to them. They can't touch it. They can't see it directly, just as they cannot return to their past, the Moscow of their childhood. So there is this story being told around the story or through the story, like through the events of what happens, the misconnections, the lovers, the blah blah blah. There's this story being told about being disconnected, about being trapped, paralyzed, about being always backward looking or forward looking. You know, that is like, this play is like, it's a great tragedy of not connecting.
Yeah. No, absolutely. That like, and over that happens, especially to the sisters, or like connect for a moment and then it's lost. Think you make a choice and then it's pulled away from you. I think especially of Irina. Irina is a pretty like clear case of that. Like, even though this isn't like, she's not on her like love story journey, she's made a choice. She's made a choice and she was like, okay, this is the way. I'm going to be a school teacher. I'm going to marry this baron, figure out a way that like work can influence my happiness, and maybe like if I have a purpose and I have some security, that's the way to happiness. Nope, he gets shot. The over and over, there's this move towards connection and then it's removed, or someone steps away, or a new post is given to all the soldiers. And I think that ebb and flow, that never, like, sometimes seeming like you could make a choice and then that choice being taken away makes the doldrums or the oppression of the play like feel that much more heavy.
No, absolutely. And it's also too, like, Chekhov is so much about like what is going on inside of every little moment. And this play, because it's such a swirl of characters and ensemble, it's a little less easy. It's harder, I guess, is a different way to say that, of to try to catch all of the little things that happen. And I also think that's part of what Chekhov is doing, is like telling this story about these small, intricate little moments that happen in this great swirl of humanity, and how important, or how much agency maybe do we like really have over those moments. But like a really spectacular little bit of writing is in just at the beginning of Act 2. So Natasha and Andre, now married, have a baby, they've moved into the house, and they apparently the sisters have decided to hold a party and bring in some musicians, right? And Natasha says, well, you know what, the baby's feeling a little sick, I'm gonna go tell the musicians not to come in. And Andre says, my sisters are in charge of the house, presumably, right? Like they made the decision. And Natasha says, of course, they're in charge too.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a subtle, small. Now, I suspect that that's probably Rule's sort of addition on there, her particular mastery of the English language that's adding something in there. But it's little shifts, little moments of power negotiation that happen that are honestly, in some ways, like lost in all of the things that happen. But it's the lostness that is the play in some ways.
Yeah, I agree. I think the amount of characters, the amount of those moments there. I've just been like scrolling through my script over here trying to find the exact one, but like one of the like tertiary, maybe quadrutiary characters has a moment like that where it's like, oh, a really heartbreaking thing is shared, and it's just like lost in the blitz of the fire night.
Yeah, it's one of the soldiers whose house is burned down. He loses everything.
That's what it is.
His guitar, his clothes, everything.
Yes, and in the midst of the fire, he loses his whole home. He says like my guitar burned down, and he's like sort of in denial, laughing about it, sort of manically, and like it just hits you, and it's like, oh my goodness. And then we're back to like something crazy happening with the sisters. And it's like, so there's so many of those, like the amount of the slowly building evidence of how much everyone is going through it. I think is maybe some of the reason why this play continues to get produced, especially recently is being produced. 'Cause that's a theme that I feel like is right there of like, we're all going through it. And these like,
it's that we're all going through it too, because like I think unlike and all Chekhov plays are ensemble pieces because they have such great, robust, large casts. But in the other three major plays, the central story, or maybe the central 2 or 3 stories, just frankly gets a lot more stage time,
right,
than any individual storyline does in this play. I think that's part of what feels frustrating about the Three Sisters, is that you never get the depth of plot from there's all kinds of stuff going on. Lovers and the brothers and gambling debts, and the babies might be sick, and crazy stuff's going on with the soldiers, and there's intrigue at City Hall, and different lovers, and different, Natasha's having an affair with the city council guy and has a child by him. There's all kinds of stuff that happens, but we never like sit down with any of it long enough. And what it kind of ends up feeling like, and I think this is intentional, is that the stuff is just happening to the characters. That it's hard for them to feel like, for us, the audience, to get a real sense of how they're moving and working on their situations, because we don't spend a lot of time in them. And that is, I think, part of Chekhov's question in this play, is a question of control. Yeah. How much control do we really have? And it's not, he's a good enough artist that he doesn't like lay out a preachy answer to that. He just asks a question and poses, really contrary, different looks. You have a doctor who feels like he has absolutely no control over anything. Meanwhile, Natasha goes from like a peasant local to running the house of the aristocrats, right, and like being in charge of everybody. So she clearly is demonstrating quite a bit of control over her situation. And it's all the stories that you never spend a lot of time with any one of them that end up like with this portrait.
Yeah. Yeah, this like mosaic of all of them like brings it together into this overall image of them just sort of finding a way through. And I think that's what some of the one of the questions I wrote down to be to as an option for a way to start the conversation is like, what's our way in to this play right now? Like if you're doing this play in 2025, what's your way into 1900s Russia with this family in the provincial countryside as they struggle to get back to Moscow? And I think that's a lot of what it is how these people are trying to move through this life together and find purpose amidst so much adversary, amidst so much pressure from the world around them.
Yeah, two quick things, and then we've got to be really close to the end of our time here. Just to hammer home, this is a great line from Masha in Act 3. So this is in the midst of the fire, the sister's bedroom that they spend the whole scene in. She's describing how she's just admitted to her sisters that she's in love with Vershinin while being married to the school teacher, right? And so she says, when you read a novel, it seems that everything is clear, trite, and understandable. But when you yourself fall in love, you understand that nobody knows anything and everyone must decide for themselves. And to me, like, I don't think that Chekhov has any one particular character that's like his stand-in or anything like that, but that he offers his perspective in little bits through all the characters. I think that's Chekhov speaking, not about the difference between novels and life, but about the kind of play he wants to write, which is not one that feels like carefully plotted and constructed, right? Masha says everything is clear, trite, and understandable. A kind of like these characters have control over their own destinies and they take actions to pursue their goals, right? And I think he's saying, I'm writing a play that's closer to life. It is nobody knows anything and everyone must decide for themselves. It's a swirl of chaos. And there's these little moments that sometimes you sort of surface and grab onto and you're like, I have control for 2 pages. Right. And then you're swirled back into the maelstrom, you know? Absolutely. And that's the experience of this play. And it's honestly frustrating at times.
Yeah.
Like, I wish that we could just develop and spend a little more time with that couple right there because that story's interesting. But no, you're thrown back into the storm and try to surface somewhere else and get a glimpse of agency. Okay, and then real quick, great scene at the end of the play. You talked about it a little bit before. Irina and Tuzenbach, the soldiers have said goodbye. We, the audience, have learned that Tuzenbach is going to duel the other suitor. And Irina says, something's been up with you all today. Where are you going? What's going on? And they have one of those scenes that is so distinctly Chekhov that it aches. That is, they talk about nothing.
Yeah.
And we, the audience, know what's about to happen. And we know he knows. And we know that she suspects.
Yeah.
And so every word is layered with tension and waiting. And is he going to tell her? And what's going to happen? And he doesn't. It's very much like what I think is one of the great scenes of all time at the end of The Cherry Orchard. The proposal that isn't a proposal, where they talk about the weather. When we know that they're supposed to be in there actually having out the proposal finally and forever, and they don't. And this is how the scene ends. She says, I'll go with you. Again, she knows something's up. He hasn't told her. They've talked about a lot of things. He's talked about the trees for a while. Not the fact that he's about to go get shot in a duel with an expert dueler, by the way. This guy's like times, a regular dueler. And so, I'll go with you. He says, no. He says, stage direction, leaving quickly, then stopping. Irina says, what? Tuzenbach, I didn't drink my coffee today. Ask them to make me some. And he leaves. I mean, that is so Chekhov, because what is he saying? Nothing. Just nothing. Just, hey, have the servants make me some coffee. But it means everything.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, to briefly gush about that scene as well. I love what you already said about like how layered it all is with different levels of meaning. I love that it's also 2 characters who don't love each other. Well, no, that's not true. Tuchenbach says that he loves Irina, and I think I'm willing to take him at his word for that. Irina says she doesn't love Tuchenbach, and moreover, they've communicated this. They communicate it in the scene. And they know that though they have chosen each other, that this tension exists. And so it is this sort of a scene that has all that heartbreak, that has all that. We're not talking about the thing that we want to talk about, but we care about each other, just not in the way that each other is like fully not on the same page necessarily, the same wavelength. There's so much great tension and juxtaposition in that scene, all amidst not actually saying the words that you're saying. So that last line, that sort of nothing line of "please have them make some coffee," have them make some coffee for me, carries with it all of that, like that hope of like, I'm still planning to come back. I'm like, the plan is still to come back. But there is still that longing for, I'm planning to come back. I hope that there's a way forward for us in amidst the lie that I'm not going out to the office or wherever I'm going to a duel. So
and
beautiful.
It's like, it's not what he should have said too, right?
Yeah.
I mean, so much of Chekhov is characters not doing the things they should do. Not only the things they should do, like morally or whatever, but also not the things that they should do, like dramatically.
Right.
You know, like it'd be a very dramatic scene if he falls with and he says, "I'm going to duel for your love," right? And I mean, you mean everything to me. You know, I hope that I'll return to you, but no, that's not what he says. Just make me some coffee, and then he goes off and gets shot.
Yeah. Hey, there's so many more pieces of this play that we could focus on. It's already been a little bit longer conversation than we tend to have on the show, but you know what? It's appropriate for the level of interwoven plot lines, ensemble story that this play is. So thank you all for being a part of this conversation, both in this episode today, but also we want to extend this conversation out to all of you. This is a play that you most likely have had some sort of shoulder rub with and would love to, we'd love to chat with you about it. So find us on any of the socials. We're at No Script Podcast. We also have a Gmail, noscriptpodcast@gmail.com. Find us on any of those sites. We'd love to keep talking about Three Sisters and all of its intricacy of character with you.
We are back next week with the beginning of Halloween in April of 4 spooky plays that we are excited to talk about. If you're excited for that, if you like this episode, if you've liked any of our other episodes, please recommend us to your family, your friends, anybody you know that likes conversations about theater, about writing, storytelling, that kind of stuff. Send them our way. They can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, YouTube, Podbean, all the places. Like our Facebook page, and a link to the new episode appears every Monday when we publish. We'll see you next week for Halloween in April. Till then, I'm Jacob. That's Jackson. Thanks for joining us for No Script, the podcast.